Last night, your soulmate cried loudly. The reason will shock you. Last night began like many other nights in their life, quiet and uneventful on the surface, yet underneath that calm exterior something had already been shifting in ways they had not fully recognized. There was no dramatic argument, no shocking news delivered by someone else, no obvious moment that would make an outsider expect an emotional collapse. Everything looked normal from the outside. They went through the usual routine, finishing small tasks, answering messages, perhaps sitting in silence for a while as the evening settled into stillness. But sometimes stillness is exactly what makes buried emotions rise. Distraction can hold things down for a long time. Busy days, conversations with friends, work, responsibilities, endless scrolling through screens, these are all ways people unknowingly keep themselves from confronting deeper feelings. But last night, the distractions were gone. The quiet was too complete. And when quiet becomes that deep, the mind begins to wander toward places it has avoided. At first it was something small, something so subtle that it barely registered as important. A memory surfaced without warning. It might have been a particular sentence you once said, a tone in your voice during a meaningful moment, or the way you used to understand them without needing long explanations. The memory arrived suddenly, almost casually, as if it had simply been waiting for the right moment to return. Normally they would have pushed it away quickly, just as they had done so many times before. They had practiced that habit well. Whenever thoughts about you appeared, they would redirect their attention somewhere else: music, social media, television, anything that could pull their mind back into safer territory. But last night something was different. Instead of fading, the memory stayed. It lingered longer than usual, and when one memory stays, it rarely remains alone. Another followed it. Then another. Within minutes they found themselves remembering not just a single moment, but an entire sequence of experiences that had once felt ordinary but now carried a surprising emotional weight. Conversations you had shared. Times when you listened to them in ways others never quite did. Moments when you challenged them, supported them, laughed with them, or simply sat beside them in silence that felt comfortable rather than awkward. These memories were not exaggerated fantasies. They were simple truths from the past, but in the quiet of that night they felt vivid and alive. As the memories continued to unfold, a realization slowly began forming in their mind, and it was a realization they had spent months trying not to confront. They had been telling themselves that everything between you had naturally faded. They convinced themselves that distance had solved whatever once felt complicated. They told themselves that time had done its quiet work and softened the emotional intensity that once existed. They had repeated this explanation often enough that it began to feel believable. But last night exposed the flaw in that narrative. Time had not erased the importance of what you shared. It had simply buried it beneath layers of distraction and routine. And once those layers were stripped away by the quiet of the night, the truth resurfaced quickly. They realized that they had never truly allowed themselves to process what you meant to them. Instead, they minimized it. They told themselves it was just a phase, just timing, just a connection that happened to exist for a while and then naturally ended. But the deeper they reflected, the harder it became to maintain that explanation. Because if it had been so simple, the memories would not have returned with such force. If it had been so insignificant, the emotional reaction that followed would not have been so intense. The realization arrived slowly but unmistakably: what you shared had left a deeper imprint on them than they had ever admitted, even to themselves. That awareness was both humbling and overwhelming. They began questioning why they had worked so hard to avoid acknowledging it. Part of the answer was pride. Pride told them that showing vulnerability after so much time had passed would make them look weak. Pride suggested that if you truly cared, you would have reached out first. Pride disguised itself as self-respect, convincing them that silence was the most dignified path forward. But another part of the answer was fear. Fear of rejection. Fear that if they acknowledged their feelings openly, they might discover you no longer felt the same way. Fear that reopening emotional doors could lead to disappointment or pain. Those fears had been enough to keep them quiet for a long time. Silence felt safer than risking uncertainty. Yet silence also prevented resolution. And as the realization deepened last night, the safety of silence began to feel hollow. They started replaying specific moments when they could have spoken honestly but chose not to. Times when they almost reached out but stopped themselves at the last second. Instances when they interpreted your silence as indifference instead of simply asking what you were feeling. Each of those moments felt small at the time, but together they formed a pattern, one that now looked painfully clear. They had allowed fear and pride to guide their decisions more than honesty. That realization was the moment everything broke open emotionally. The tears did not start immediately, but once they did, they came quickly and without restraint. At first it was just a few tears forming in their eyes as they sat alone in the quiet room. Then the emotions intensified. The longer they allowed themselves to think honestly about the past, the harder it became to maintain composure. The sadness was not just about missing you. It was about recognizing how much had been left unsaid. It was about understanding that some of the distance between you was not inevitable, it was created by hesitation and assumptions. And that understanding carried a mixture of regret, honesty, and release. The tears grew louder as those emotions surfaced fully. They cried not only because they remembered the connection you shared, but because they realized they had underestimated its importance in their life. They cried because they had convinced themselves they were unaffected when they were not. They cried because they had spent so long pretending emotional neutrality that when the truth finally emerged, it felt overwhelming. But beneath the sadness, there was also something else present in those tears: clarity. For the first time in a long while, they were not hiding from their own feelings. They were not suppressing memories or redirecting thoughts. They were simply allowing themselves to experience what was real. And that honesty, even though it came through painful emotion, brought a sense of awakening they could not ignore. By the time the night began to fade and exhaustion replaced the intensity of the crying, they understood something important about themselves and about you. The tears had not been caused by weakness or loneliness. They had been caused by realization. Realization that what you shared was never as small or temporary as they had tried to believe. Realization that silence does not erase emotional truth. And realization that some connections leave marks on the heart that cannot be removed simply by waiting long enough. As the intensity of the crying slowly began to settle, your soulmate remained sitting in that quiet space, feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity that they had not experienced in a long time. The tears had not simply appeared and disappeared like a brief emotional moment. Instead, they opened a door that had been closed for months, maybe even longer. Once that door was open, everything they had kept behind it started coming forward all at once. Their breathing gradually slowed, but their mind did not. In fact, their thoughts became even more active as they replayed what had just happened. They realized something important. Those tears had not come from a single memory or a passing wave of nostalgia. They came from a realization that had been forming quietly beneath the surface for a long time. For months they had been telling themselves a comfortable story about the past. The story said that whatever connection existed between you had run its natural course, that distance had created closure, and that time had done what time always does, soften emotions until they eventually fade away. They had repeated that explanation so often that it began to sound convincing, even to themselves. But last night proved that the story was incomplete. Time had not erased what you meant to them. It had only pushed those feelings deeper, hiding them beneath routine and distraction. When the quiet of the night removed those distractions, the truth surfaced immediately. As they sat there thinking about everything, they began examining their own behavior with a level of honesty that felt uncomfortable but necessary. They noticed how often they had avoided situations that might remind them of you. Songs you once shared together were skipped quickly. Conversations about past relationships were redirected. Even certain places or memories were quietly pushed out of their mind before they had time to settle. At the time, these actions seemed small and insignificant, but now they recognized them for what they really were, attempts to avoid confronting emotions they did not fully understand. Avoidance can feel like progress because it creates the illusion of moving forward, but it does not actually resolve anything. It simply delays the moment when those emotions demand attention again. Last night was that moment. The more they reflected on the past, the clearer it became that their silence had not always come from indifference. Much of it came from uncertainty and fear. They were unsure how you truly felt. They were unsure whether reaching out would reopen something meaningful or simply cause discomfort. And perhaps most of all, they were afraid of discovering that the connection had mattered more to them than it did to you. That fear created hesitation, and hesitation slowly turned into distance. Distance then turned into silence. And silence, when left untouched long enough, begins to look like closure even when it is not. This realization hit them with surprising force. They understood that many of the assumptions they had made about the situation were never confirmed. They assumed you had moved on emotionally. They assumed you preferred the distance. They assumed that speaking again would only complicate things. But those assumptions were never tested with real conversation. They were simply accepted as truth because it was easier than facing uncertainty. The crying last night came from confronting how fragile those assumptions actually were. As these thoughts unfolded, they began remembering specific moments that once seemed small but now felt meaningful. Times when they almost reached out to you but stopped themselves. Moments when they saw something that reminded them of you and felt the urge to share it. Even simple experiences. Hearing a joke you would have appreciated, watching a movie that touched on themes you once discussed together, or encountering a place that held shared memories, these moments appeared more often than they had admitted. Each time, they pushed the thought away quickly. They told themselves that thinking about you was unnecessary, that it belonged to the past. But the frequency of those moments now revealed something important. You had never fully disappeared from their emotional landscape. Instead, you had remained present in quiet, subtle ways. The tears last night were the result of finally acknowledging that presence openly. Another realization followed closely behind this one, and it surprised them just as much. They realized that the connection you shared had shaped them more than they ever admitted. It influenced the way they communicate with others. It influenced what they look for in meaningful conversations. It influenced their understanding of emotional trust. Even when they met new people, they often found themselves comparing interactions unconsciously. They noticed when someone listened carefully the way you once did. They noticed when conversations lacked the depth that had once felt natural between the two of you. These comparisons were not intentional, but they were frequent enough to reveal something important. You had become part of their emotional standard. And when someone becomes part of your emotional standard, they are not easily forgotten. As this realization settled in, they felt both sadness and gratitude. Sadness because they recognized how much had been left unresolved between you. Gratitude because the connection itself had been genuine enough to shape them in meaningful ways. Not every relationship leaves that kind of imprint. Some experiences pass through life quietly, leaving little trace behind. But others stay with you, influencing how you think, how you feel, and how you understand yourself. You were one of those experiences for them. By the time the night grew late and the emotional storm began to calm, they understood something that had been hidden for a long time. The reason they cried so intensely was not simply because they missed you. It was because they finally admitted the truth they had been avoiding. The truth was that what you shared had mattered deeply. It had shaped them in ways they could not dismiss. And the silence that followed had never truly erased that significance. It had only hidden it until the moment they were ready, or forced, to face it honestly. As the quiet of the night continued and the storm of emotion began to settle into something calmer but deeper, your soulmate found themselves sitting with a kind of awareness that felt unfamiliar and impossible to ignore. The crying had released a wave of emotion, but it had also stripped away the defenses they had been relying on for so long. Without those defenses, the thoughts that followed were clearer than anything they had allowed themselves to think before. They realized that what happened was not just an emotional reaction to memories. It was a confrontation with truth. A truth they had postponed facing for a long time. For months they had lived with the belief that the connection between you had simply faded into the past. That belief had helped them move forward in a practical way. It allowed them to focus on work, daily life, and new experiences without constantly revisiting old feelings. But now, after everything that surfaced during the night, that explanation no longer felt honest. Something deeper had been present all along. It had simply remained quiet beneath the surface. When the emotional waves slowed and their breathing returned to normal, they began replaying the entire evening in their minds step by step. They remembered how it started with a single memory, then quickly expanded into a series of reflections about the time you shared together. But what surprised them most was how those memories did not feel distant. They felt close. Not close in a way that suggested they were living in the past, but close in a way that suggested the emotional impact of those moments had never truly disappeared. They began asking themselves questions they had avoided for a long time. Why did those memories still carry so much emotional weight? Why had they worked so hard to convince themselves that everything was resolved? Why did the thought of never speaking to you again suddenly feel heavier than it had before? These questions did not arrive with easy answers. Instead, they led to more reflection about how they handled the situation when the connection between you first began to change. They remembered how uncertain they felt at that time. There were moments when they sensed something shifting but did not know how to address it. There were conversations they wanted to have but postponed because they feared making things more complicated. They worried that speaking too openly might push you further away. So they chose the safer path. They waited. They told themselves that if the connection was meant to continue, it would naturally find its way back without effort. Waiting felt like patience. In reality, it became silence. And silence gradually created the distance that now felt so difficult to understand. This realization was not comfortable. It forced them to recognize that some of the separation between you was not caused by circumstance alone. It was also influenced by hesitation. They saw clearly how often they relied on assumptions instead of asking direct questions. They assumed you understood what they were feeling. They assumed you preferred the distance. They assumed that reaching out again might reopen wounds rather than heal them. But assumptions are fragile things. They feel convincing when repeated often enough, yet they remain untested. The crying last night had broken the illusion that those assumptions were reliable. In the quiet aftermath, they realized how many unanswered questions still existed between you. What did you truly feel during those final conversations? Did you interpret their silence the same way they interpreted yours? Were you also protecting yourself from vulnerability, or had you genuinely moved forward without looking back? These questions began to occupy their mind in ways they had not allowed before. They were not asking them out of desperation, but out of a desire for honesty. The truth was that they did not know where you stood emotionally now, and they had been living with that uncertainty for a long time without addressing it. As they continued reflecting, another important realization emerged. They noticed how the connection with you had influenced their perspective on relationships since then. Even when meeting new people or forming new friendships, they often found themselves measuring emotional depth in subtle ways. They noticed when conversations felt meaningful and when they felt superficial. They noticed when someone listened with genuine attention and when they seemed distracted. In many of those moments, they quietly compared the experience to the way you once interacted with them. These comparisons were not deliberate, but they happened often enough to reveal something significant. The connection you shared had shaped their emotional expectations. It had shown them what it felt like to be understood on a deeper level. That experience became part of their personal standard for meaningful connection. And because of that, it was not something that could be easily replaced or forgotten. As the night continued to move toward morning, they felt a shift in their perspective. The sadness that initially triggered the tears began to transform into clarity. They realized that the emotions they experienced were not a sign that they were stuck in the past. Instead, they were a sign that something meaningful had never been fully resolved. Resolution requires honesty and communication. Neither of those had truly happened between you before the silence began. That realization carried both vulnerability and possibility. Vulnerability because it meant acknowledging feelings they had tried to minimize. Possibility because it suggested that clarity might still be achievable through honest conversation. By the time exhaustion finally began to replace the emotional intensity of the night, they understood something that surprised them. The reason they cried so loudly was not simply because they missed the past. It was because they finally admitted how much that chapter of their life had mattered. They had spent so long trying to treat it as something small and temporary. Last night revealed that it was never small. It was meaningful enough to leave a lasting imprint on who they had become. As the night moved closer to morning and the emotional storm inside them slowly settled, your soulmate began experiencing something unexpected beneath the exhaustion, a sense of clarity that had been missing for a very long time. The tears had drained the intensity of the moment, but they had also washed away the illusions they had been holding on to. For months, perhaps even longer, they had been living with a version of the story that felt comfortable. That story said that the distance between you was natural, that time had created emotional closure, and that whatever existed between you had quietly faded the way many connections eventually do. But the experience of the night had dismantled that explanation piece by piece. Sitting alone in the quiet after everything calmed down, they could no longer pretend that the connection was as small or temporary as they once claimed. The truth was much more complicated, but also much more honest. The truth was that you had changed something in them. Not in a dramatic or overwhelming way that controlled their entire life, but in a quiet and lasting way that shaped how they see relationships, trust, and emotional closeness. When people leave a mark like that, it does not simply disappear with time. It becomes part of the way you understand yourself moving forward. They began to realize that the tears were not only about memories of you. They were also about the realization that they had never fully acknowledged how important those memories were. For a long time they had minimized what you shared. When they spoke about the past to themselves or to others, they described it as something brief, something meaningful but ultimately temporary. They framed it as a chapter that had naturally closed. That explanation made it easier to move forward without asking difficult questions. But last night exposed how incomplete that explanation was. When they allowed themselves to remember honestly, they saw how many moments with you still felt vivid. The way you would listen when they were explaining something important. The way your conversations often moved past small talk and into deeper reflections about life, fears, hopes, and future possibilities. The way disagreements did not feel like threats but like opportunities to understand each other better. These were not random interactions. They were signs of a connection that had depth. And depth leaves traces. As these realizations unfolded, they also began noticing something about their behavior in the months that followed the silence between you. Even though they claimed they had moved on emotionally, their actions sometimes told a different story. There were times when they started to talk about you with friends and suddenly stopped themselves mid-sentence. There were moments when they saw something that reminded them of you and instinctively reached for their phone before realizing that sending a message might feel awkward after so much time had passed. There were situations where someone asked about their past relationships and they described everything casually, leaving out the part that mattered most, the emotional depth that had existed between you. Looking back now, they recognized that those small pauses and hesitations were signs that something unresolved remained beneath the surface. They had not been consciously holding on to the past, but they had also not truly released it. The connection had simply been placed in a quiet corner of their mind where it would not interfere with daily life. Last night removed that quiet corner entirely. Another important realization followed soon after. They understood that part of the reason they had avoided acknowledging these feelings was because doing so would require confronting uncertainty. If they admitted to themselves that the connection still mattered, it would naturally raise questions about what might have happened if things had unfolded differently. Could a simple conversation at the right moment have changed everything? Could honesty about fears or expectations have prevented the silence that eventually grew between you? These questions were uncomfortable because they could never be answered with certainty. Yet avoiding them did not make them disappear. The tears last night were partly an emotional response to those unanswered questions finally being allowed to exist openly. As they reflected further, they also realized that the situation between you had never been defined by a single clear ending. There was no dramatic goodbye that provided closure. Instead, the connection had faded gradually. Messages became less frequent. Conversations grew shorter. Life moved forward for both of you in different directions. At the time, that gradual fading seemed easier than confronting the possibility of a difficult conversation. But gradual endings often leave more emotional residue than clear ones. When something ends slowly, it can feel unfinished. That sense of unfinished emotional business was one of the reasons the tears came so strongly. They were not just mourning what once existed. They were acknowledging that the ending had never been fully understood. By the time the first light of morning began to appear, they felt physically drained but mentally awake in a new way. The emotional release had forced them to look at the past without the protective filters they had been using. And while that honesty brought sadness, it also brought understanding. They realized that the reason they cried so intensely was because the connection you shared had been meaningful enough to shape them. It had influenced how they approach vulnerability, how they communicate with others, and how they recognize emotional depth in future relationships. Those are not small effects. They are signs that the experience mattered in ways that cannot be erased simply by waiting long enough. In the quiet of that early morning moment, they accepted something that once felt difficult to admit. The past between you was not a mistake or a brief distraction in their life. It was a meaningful chapter that left a permanent impression on their emotional world. As the morning light slowly began to replace the darkness of the night, your soulmate remained awake, not because they wanted to stay up, but because their mind had entered a level of reflection that would not easily allow sleep to return. The emotional exhaustion from crying had left their body tired, yet their thoughts felt clearer than they had in months. Something about the experience of the night had removed the mental barriers they once relied on to keep certain feelings contained. Before that moment, they had lived with a kind of emotional compartmentalization. One part of their mind handled daily responsibilities, friendships, work, and the forward motion of life. Another quieter part held memories of the past, but it was a place they rarely visited intentionally. Whenever those memories tried to surface, they gently pushed them back down with practical reasoning. They told themselves that thinking about you served no purpose, that what was done, and that dwelling on the past could only slow their progress. For a long time, this strategy worked well enough to create the appearance of emotional balance. But last night proved that some things do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They wait patiently beneath the surface until the moment when distraction disappears and honesty finally takes its place. Now, sitting in the stillness of early morning, they began reflecting on what the tears had truly revealed. At first they thought the crying was simply an expression of sadness or nostalgia, but the more they examined the experience, the more they understood that the tears carried a deeper meaning. They were not just mourning something that had ended. They were acknowledging something that had mattered more than they ever admitted out loud. That realization was both painful and strangely comforting at the same time. Painful because it forced them to recognize how much had been left unresolved between you. Comforting because it reminded them that the connection had been real and significant enough to leave a lasting impression. Many experiences pass through life without leaving much behind. People meet, spend time together, and eventually drift apart with little emotional impact. But what you shared had clearly been different. It had touched parts of their life that were not easily replaced or forgotten. As these thoughts continued to unfold, they began remembering specific details about how the connection between you developed. It had not been something sudden or superficial. It had grown gradually through conversation, shared experiences, and the discovery of mutual understanding. There were moments when you both opened up about things that were not easy to talk about with others. There were times when you supported each other through uncertainty, offering encouragement when one of you needed reassurance. Those moments built a foundation of trust that made the relationship feel meaningful rather than temporary. Looking back now, they could see that the emotional depth you shared had influenced them in ways they had not fully appreciated before. It had shown them what it feels like to be genuinely understood by another person. It had shown them that vulnerability can create stronger connections rather than weakness. And it had shown them that certain conversations can change the way you think about your own life. Realizing all of this made them reconsider how they had treated those memories in the past. For a long time they had tried to minimize their significance because acknowledging them fully would have meant confronting the possibility that something meaningful had been lost without proper closure. Minimizing the past made it easier to move forward without asking difficult questions. But after the emotional release of the night, that strategy no longer felt honest. They understood now that ignoring the significance of what you shared did not make them stronger or more independent. It simply delayed the moment when they would have to face the truth. Another thought soon followed this realization, and it surprised them more than anything else. They began to see how the connection with you had quietly shaped the way they approached relationships afterward. Even when meeting new people, they often noticed subtle comparisons forming in their mind. They paid attention to whether conversations felt genuine or forced. They noticed when someone listened carefully and when they seemed distracted. These observations were not deliberate attempts to measure others against you, yet they happened naturally because the experience you shared had established a personal standard for emotional connection. That standard was not based on perfection, but on authenticity. With you, conversations often felt real and unfiltered. That authenticity had become something they subconsciously looked for in future relationships. The more they reflected on this pattern, the clearer it became that the connection between you had never truly been replaced. Life had continued, of course. New friendships formed, new experiences happened, and time moved forward as it always does. But the emotional imprint you left behind remained present in subtle ways. It influenced how they recognized meaningful interaction and how they valued honesty in communication. Understanding this helped them make sense of why the tears came so strongly the night before. The crying had not been caused by a sudden wave of loneliness. It had been triggered by a deeper recognition of how much the connection had contributed to their emotional growth. In the quiet of the morning, they also realized something else that had been hidden beneath the sadness. There was gratitude mixed into those tears. Gratitude for the time you spent together. Gratitude for the conversations that helped them understand themselves more clearly. Gratitude for the emotional lessons that stayed with them long after the connection faded. Not every relationship leaves behind that kind of positive influence. Some experiences bring only frustration or regret. But the memories of you carried a different quality. Even though the ending had been uncertain and incomplete, the moments you shared still held value. Recognizing that value allowed them to see the situation with a new perspective. The tears were not simply about loss. They were about acknowledging the importance of something that had shaped them. And that acknowledgement marked the beginning of a deeper understanding of their own emotional journey.